Close your eyes for a moment and try to forget the London you know. Forget the underground map, the glass towers, the crowds moving at the pace of screens and schedules. Instead, picture a city where childhood does not mean school, play, or protection. Picture London at the height of its growth, swelling faster than anyone can truly manage, its streets thick with smoke, noise, and urgency. This is a city powered not just by steam, horses, or coal, but by something far quieter and far easier to overlook. Small hands, small bodies, young faces hardened far too early. When we talk about how London worked, how it functioned day after day, we usually credit inventors, factory owners, lawmakers, or merchants. But if you strip the city down to its moving parts, to the things that actually kept it running from morning until night, you begin to notice something unsettling. Children were everywhere, not on the margins, not occasionally, but at the very centre of urban life. They carried messages, cleaned machinery, hauled goods, swept chimneys, sorted coal, ran errands, and filled the gaps adults either could not or would not. London didn't just employ children, it depended on them. Before we go any further, if you're planning to stay with me through this journey, I'd love for you to subscribe now. These stories take time to tell properly, and we're going to move slowly, carefully, and honestly through them. And while you're here, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from, city, town, or country. I read those, and it helps me picture how far these voices from the past are travelling today. Now let's step back into the streets, because to understand why children mattered so much, you first need to understand what kind of city London actually was. London in the late 18th and early 19th centuries was not designed for the population it held. It expanded faster than laws, infrastructure, or social customs could keep up. People poured in from the countryside chasing wages, stability, or survival, and the city absorbed them with little planning and even less mercy. Housing was crowded, sanitation primitive, and work was everywhere, but rarely secure. For adults, employment could be irregular, seasonal, or brutally competitive. For children, however, the city offered something different. Their size made them useful. Their obedience made them manageable. Their wages, tiny as they were, made them attractive to employers who needed speed, flexibility, and low cost. Childhood, as a protected stage of life, had not yet solidified into the idea we recognize today. Many families simply saw work as a natural extension of growing up. If a child could walk, carry, fit into narrow spaces, or follow instructions, then that child could earn. One of the first places you'd notice this is on the streets themselves. London ran on movement. Messages needed to travel quickly. Goods had to reach shops, docks, workshops, and homes. Adults moved slower. Children ran. Errand boys darted through traffic carrying notes, parcels, and verbal instructions. They memorized routes instinctively, learning shortcuts through alleys and back passages that never appeared on maps. Some worked independently, hired task by task. Others were attached to shops, offices, or households, always on call. Their labour wasn't officially recorded in neat ledgers, but it was constant. If you removed these children from the streets, the city would have slowed to a crawl. Communication alone would have suffered. In a world before telephones or reliable postal delivery for urgent business, these children were living infrastructure. Then there were the workshops and factories, which expanded rapidly as industrialization reshaped London's economy. Not all industry took place in vast mills. Much of it was cramped, local, and improvised. Small workshops relied on children to clean, sort, carry, and assist skilled adult workers. Inside, textile production, children untangled threads, replaced broken spools, and crawled beneath machines to retrieve scraps or fix jams. Their height and flexibility allowed factory layouts to become more dangerous, not less. Machines were designed with the assumption that someone small could reach inside them while they were still running. Injuries were common. Missing fingers, crushed hands, and lifelong disabilities were treated as unfortunate but acceptable costs of productivity. For many families, the income mattered more than the risk. A child's weekly wage, however small, could mean the difference between rent paid and eviction. Some of the most dangerous work in London relied almost entirely on children. Chimney sweeping is one of the clearest examples. Houses built with narrow flues required bodies small enough to climb inside them, scraping soot from brick walls as they went. Children were lowered or forced upward through these tight, filthy spaces, often naked to avoid snagging on bricks. Burns, suffocation, deformities, and long-term illness were common. Yet the practice continued because it was efficient and cheap. Adults physically could not do the job. Mechanical alternatives existed, but cost more. And so children became tools, fitted precisely to the needs of the city's architecture. The city did not adapt to them. They adapted to the city, often at terrible personal cost. The river, too, depended on children. Along the Thames, small boys and girls, known as mudlarks, scavenged the shoreline at low tide. They searched for anything that could be sold: coal fragments, rope, metal, scraps of wood, lost cargo. It was filthy, dangerous work, carried out barefoot in freezing water among sharp debris and sewage. But it provided a form of independence that some families relied on. These children operated in the grey areas of the economy, unofficial but essential. They recovered value from waste, feeding small but steady streams of material back into the city's commercial circulation. London produced enormous amounts of refuse. Children turned that refuse into income. Domestic service, often imagined as a more respectable path, also absorbed huge numbers of young workers. Children as young as 7 or 8 were sent into other people's homes to work long hours for food, shelter, and minimal pay. They cleaned, carried water, lit fires, scrubbed floors, and ran errands. For many families, sending a child into service was a survival strategy. One less mouth to feed, one more small income stream. These children lived under constant supervision, vulnerable to exploitation, punishment, and abuse. But their labour made middle and upper-class households function smoothly. Without them, domestic life as it existed simply wouldn't have worked. What's striking is how normalised all of this was. Children working long hours wasn't considered shocking. It was expected. Newspapers, reports, and government inquiries from the period often describe child labour in practical, administrative terms. The focus was rarely on whether children should be working at all, but on whether their work could be made slightly safer or more efficient. When reformers raised concerns, they were often dismissed as sentimental or unrealistic. London, after all, needed labour. Families needed income. The city's momentum felt unstoppable, and children were part of the machinery that kept it moving forward. Education, when it existed, fit around work rather than replacing it. Many children attended school sporadically, early in the morning or late in the evening, if at all. Fatigue was normal. Hunger was normal. Work shaped bodies and minds before formal learning ever had the chance. The idea that childhood should be a time primarily for development rather than labour was still emerging, unevenly and slowly. For the poorest families, it often remained an abstract luxury. As I move through these stories, I want you to notice something important. London didn't rely on children because it was uniquely cruel. It relied on them because the systems in place made their labour useful, profitable, and easy to ignore. Adults benefited from their work at every level, often without thinking about it. A delivered message, a swept hearth, a clean workshop floor. Each small convenience rested on young shoulders. The city's growth was built not only on innovation and ambition, but on silence, on the fact that children were seen and yet not truly seen at all. By the early 19th century, the scale of child labour became impossible to ignore entirely. Investigations, reports and testimonies began to document what had long been visible on the streets. Lawmakers slowly, reluctantly began to intervene. But those changes did not arrive quickly, and they did not arrive evenly. For generations, children had already shaped London's daily rhythms. They had learned its geography by heart. They had paid for its progress with their health, their safety, and often their lives. And this is where I want to pause, because we've only begun to scratch the surface. We've looked at how children moved through the city, how they filled its gaps, how their labour became invisible through familiarity. But there's more to uncover. The voices recorded in testimony, the moments when the system cracked, and the ways this hidden workforce finally forced London to confront what it had become. When you begin to follow the paper trail left behind by this city, the tone changes, street noise fades, and what you're left with are voices captured in ink, testimonies, inquiries, and reports written by people who finally stopped pretending they didn't see what was happening. By the early 19th century, Britain's rapid industrial expansion had started to unsettle even those who benefited most from it. London's scale made denial harder. Too many children were visible, limping through alleyways, asleep on workshop floors, coughing their way through adolescence. And so, slowly, almost reluctantly, questions began to surface. Not emotional ones at first, but administrative ones. How young was too young? How many hours were too many? How damaged was acceptable before work became impossible? These weren't asked out of sudden compassion. They were asked because the system itself was starting to strain under the consequences of overuse. One of the clearest windows we have into this period comes from parliamentary investigations. Committees summoned children to speak about their lives, often for the first time anyone had asked them directly. What's striking when you read these accounts is how matter-of-fact the children are. They don't dramatize their suffering. They describe it the way someone describes the weather. Long hours, beatings for mistakes, falling asleep while standing, crawling into machines that were still moving. These children didn't frame their experiences as injustice. They framed them as normal. And that normalization is perhaps the most disturbing part. When pain is routine, it stops being remarkable. It becomes background noise, like the hum of machinery that never quite turns off. Take factory labour as an example. Many children worked 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. Shifts often began before sunrise and ended well after dark. Breaks were short. Meals were hurried or skipped. Discipline was harsh because speed mattered more than safety. If a child slowed production, they were punished. Not because an employer was uniquely cruel, but because the system rewarded output and ignored cost. The body of a child was cheaper to replace than the downtime caused by a stopped machine. That calculus wasn't hidden. It was openly understood, and it shaped how children were treated, spoken to, and valued. In London, unlike some northern factory towns, child labour wasn't concentrated in one industry. It was everywhere, scattered across hundreds of trades. That diffusion made it harder to regulate and easier to overlook. A child working in a small workshop didn't attract the same scrutiny as a child in a massive mill. A boy sweeping floors or carrying tools looked helpful, not exploited. A girl sewing buttons or sorting materials looked busy, not endangered. This fragmentation allowed the system to persist even as reform gathered momentum elsewhere. London's complexity protected its worst, habits. The family played a complicated role in all of this. It's tempting to cast parents as villains, But the reality is harsher and more constrained. For many working-class families, sending children to work was not a choice made lightly. Wages for adults were often unstable. Illness, injury, or seasonal downturns could destroy a household overnight. A child's income, however small, could mean survival. Rent paid, bread bought, fire lit. Parents lived with constant anxiety, knowing that refusing work for a child might mean hunger for everyone. Love didn't disappear in these households. It was simply forced to coexist with desperation. That desperation also shaped how children understood themselves. Many took pride in their work because pride was easier to carry than fear. Being useful meant being needed. Being needed meant having a place in the world. Boys especially were taught early that endurance was a virtue. Complaints were weakness. Pain was proof of effort. Girls learned endurance differently, often in silence, carrying burdens that were physical and emotional. Domestic service isolated them from family, while tying their identity to obedience and invisibility. Their labor was constant, but their presence was meant to fade into the background. What reformers began to realize, slowly and unevenly, was that this system didn't just harm individual children, it reshaped society. Children who grew up exhausted, injured, or uneducated became adults with limited options. Poverty reproduced itself. Ill health spread. Productivity suffered in the long term, even if it surged in the short term. Reports began to frame child labor as a national problem, not just a moral one. A weakened population threatened military strength, economic stability, and social order. Compassion entered the conversation, but it was accompanied by calculation. Early legislation attempted to limit the worst abuses, but enforcement was inconsistent. Laws were passed, restricting hours or setting minimum ages, yet loopholes were common and oversight minimal. Employers found ways around restrictions. Birth records were vague or non-existent. Inspectors were few, and many families themselves resisted changes that threatened their income. Reform was not a clean break. It was a long, uneven negotiation between necessity and conscience. London, with its sheer scale and diversity, lagged behind smaller industrial centres in meaningful enforcement. What's easy to miss in these discussions is how children themselves responded. Some resisted quietly, running away, sabotaging work, or shifting between jobs to escape the worst conditions. Others adapted so fully that work became their identity. They navigated the city with competence that would impress any adult. They knew which streets were safe, which employers paid on time, which docks offered scraps after unloading. Their resilience was real, but it came at a cost that rarely shows up in statistics. Lost childhood is hard to quantify. Emotional damage doesn't leave neat records. By the time public opinion began to shift more decisively, generations of children had already passed through London's labour system. Their stories survive only in fragments. A testimony here, a medical report there, a line in a census. When we talk about reform, it's important to remember that progress didn't erase the past. It arrived too late for many. The city they built did not return the favour. As we move forward, the focus shifts again, from exposure to response, from documentation to change. The slow emergence of a new idea, that childhood might deserve protection not because it's economically inefficient, but because it's human. That idea didn't arrive fully formed. It was argued over, resisted, reshaped, and compromised, and London once again became the testing ground. In the next part, we'll look at how the city began to confront itself, how reform took shape in practice, and how the lives of children started, unevenly, imperfectly, to change. By the time reform began to move from paper into practice, London was already wrestling with the consequences of decades of unchecked growth. The city had become too large, too interconnected, and too visible to ignore its own damage. Children were no longer just anonymous figures darting through streets or bent over workshop benches. They were appearing in medical reports, in court cases, in statistics that hinted at a deeper structural problem. Doctors began noting patterns: stunted growth, spinal deformities, chronic respiratory illness in adolescents who should have been physically resilient. Teachers, where schooling existed at all, described pupils who fell asleep at their desks, unable to concentrate, their bodies trained for labour rather than learning. Slowly, the narrative began to shift. Child labour was no longer framed only as a family issue or an employer's choice. It became a question of what kind of society London was becoming. Reform, however, did not arrive as a single sweeping change. It crept in through compromises. Early factory legislation focused on hours rather than conditions, assuming that shorter days might limit harm without disrupting production too severely. But London's industries were fragmented and adaptable. Work spilled beyond factories into homes, workshops, and informal spaces that laws struggled to reach. A child might technically be protected under one regulation while working just as long in another setting that fell outside its scope. Enforcement depended on inspectors who were too few, underfunded, and often resisted by employers who viewed oversight as intrusion. Even when violations were identified, penalties were light. The system bent, but it did not break. Public awareness played an increasingly important role. Newspapers began publishing accounts of extreme cases, often framed to shock middle-class readers into attention. Illustrations, pamphlets, and lectures brought images of exhausted children into drawing, rooms far removed from the streets where those children lived. Philanthropic organizations formed, some genuinely motivated by concern, others by a desire to impose order on what they saw as dangerous poverty. Ragged schools, charitable kitchens, and reform societies offered partial relief. They provided food, basic education, and supervision, but they also reflected tension. Help was often conditional. Discipline and moral instruction accompanied aid reminders that assistance was a privilege, not a right. Children themselves remained largely voiceless in shaping these reforms. Adults debated their futures in committee rooms while the children continued to work. When their voices did surface, they were filtered through testimony, selected to serve arguments already in motion. A child's suffering became evidence rather than experience. This mattered because it shaped the limits of reform. The goal was rarely to eliminate child labour entirely. It was to make it tolerable, regulated, and less visibly damaging. Work was still seen as formative, even beneficial if properly managed. The idea that children should be fully removed from the labour market was still radical, and for many families, impractical. Education expanded during this period, but unevenly. Compulsory schooling did not arrive all at once, and when it did, it clashed directly with household economics. A child in school was a child not earning. Attendance laws were resisted, evaded, or selectively enforced. Some families moved frequently to avoid scrutiny. Others relied on employers willing to bend rules. The city adapted again, finding ways to preserve old habits within new frameworks. Change was happening, but it was slower and messier than reformers hoped. What's important to understand here is that London did not suddenly become kinder. It became more self-aware. Reform emerged not from a moral awakening alone, but from fear of instability. Crowded slums, disease outbreaks, and social unrest forced the city to reckon with its foundations. Children, once invisible labour, were now seen as future citizens, workers, soldiers, and voters. Their condition mattered because it shaped the city's future strength. Protection, in this sense, was pragmatic as much as compassionate. Yet even as conditions improved for some, many children remained trapped in the margins. Street work persisted. Informal labour thrived wherever oversight was weakest. Girls, in particular, often slipped through reform efforts entirely, their domestic labour hidden behind private doors. The city's progress was uneven, layered, and deeply dependent on class. Middle-class childhood began to resemble the protected ideal we recognise today, while working-class childhood lagged behind, still shaped by necessity and compromise. As London moved toward the late 19th century, the city carried its contradictions forward. Child labour decreased, but it did not vanish. The idea of childhood transformed, but unevenly. What had once been normal became controversial. What had once been invisible became documented. And beneath it all, the city still bore the marks of those small hands that had built, cleaned, carried, and maintained it for generations. This is the moment where the story turns reflective. Not because the problem was solved, but because the city began to remember, to archive, to analyse itself. And in doing so, London started to confront a truth that still echoes today. Progress is often built quietly, on lives that history almost forgets. In the final part, we'll step back and look at what all of this left behind. How the legacy of child labour shaped modern London, how memory softened some edges and sharpened others, and why these stories still matter long after the factories fell silent. By the time the 19th century drew toward its end, London had changed its language, not its reality entirely, but the way it spoke about itself. Childhood was no longer casually described as a stage of usefulness. It was increasingly framed as a stage of formation, something fragile, something that required guidance rather than extraction. That shift did not erase what came before it. Instead, it layered new ideals over old foundations. The city still carried the physical and social imprint of generations who had grown up working. Their bodies aged early. Their opportunities narrowed quickly. Their relationship to authority was shaped by obedience learned too young. London's modern identity, the one we recognise today, did not emerge despite these children. It emerged through them. If you walk through London now, it's easy to forget how deeply embedded child labour once was in the city's rhythms. Streets that are now lined with cafes and offices were once crowded with errand boys weaving between carts. Homes that feel solid and safe were once maintained by young servants rising before dawn. Entire industries relied on children so completely that removing them forced structural change. Machinery had to become safer. Workflows had to slow. Adults had to be paid more. Progress, in that sense, was expensive, and it took far longer to arrive than we often admit. Memory softened the edges of this history. As reforms took hold and living standards improved, the earlier period began to be framed as unfortunate but necessary, a stepping stone, something regrettable perhaps, but unavoidable. That narrative is comforting. It suggests inevitability. It allows us to admire the outcome without sitting too long with the cost. But history doesn't actually support that comfort. Other choices were always possible. They were simply inconvenient, expensive, politically risky. Children worked not because no alternative existed, but because alternatives required sacrifice from those with power. What remains most striking, when you read accounts from adults who survived this system, is not just the hardship, but the silence that followed. Many rarely spoke about their childhoods in detail. Work blurred memory. Pain normalized itself. Survival left little room for reflection. And when society finally shifted its values, those who had already paid the price were rarely invited into the conversation. Reform celebrated the future. It did not compensate the past. This matters because it shapes how we tell London's story. Cities love to highlight moments of triumph, rebuilding after fire, expansion through trade, innovation through industry. But those moments rest on quieter labour, much of it performed by people too young to consent, too poor to refuse, and too ordinary to be remembered individually. When we say London became great, the question worth asking is always the same. Great for whom, and at what moment? Even today, traces of this legacy linger, not in child labour on the same scale, but in attitudes toward work, worth, and endurance. The idea that hardship builds character, that early struggle is preparation, that usefulness equals value. These beliefs did not vanish. They evolved, and they still shape how society talks about opportunity and responsibility. History doesn't disappear when laws change. It echoes. That's why I keep returning to these stories. Not to judge the past by modern standards, but to understand how modern standards came to exist at all. Childhood in London wasn't protected because someone suddenly became kinder. It was protected because enough damage accumulated that ignoring it became impossible. The city learned, slowly, painfully, and incompletely. And that learning process is written into its streets just as much as its monuments. If you've stayed with me this far, I want to thank you. These aren't easy stories, and they aren't meant to be consumed quickly. They ask us to slow down, to imagine lives very different from our own, and to recognize how deeply connected we are to people we'll never meet. That connection is the reason this channel exists, to tell the stories beneath the stories, to sit with the uncomfortable parts, not because they're shocking, but because they're true. If you found this valuable, consider staying with me for the next one. Subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments what part of this history stayed with you the most. These conversations don't end when the video does. They carry forward, just like the city itself. I'll see you in the next journey through London's past.